Hey guys, welcome to Module 1. This is going to be our Module 1 short lecture. And this week, I'm just going to highlight the three branches of the criminal justice system. Your assignment for this week is pretty minimal. It's just a discussion board assignment, but you also need to make sure you start reviewing what's required for your final project so you have some idea, okay? And each week I will provide a short module lecture, usually about 15 minutes, in which I will cover some of the key concepts associated with our specific assignments for the week. All right? Again, so this week I just want to talk about the criminal justice system and identify the three branches that are common knowledge elements that comprise our criminal justice system. All right? So first, we're going to identify those three branches, and those are going to be law enforcement or cops, courts, and corrections. So those are the three primary branches, again, cops, courts, and corrections that comprise our criminal justice system. So each of those branches have a specific responsibility to those of us in society. And so first we're going to talk about law enforcement, right? The primary purpose behind law enforcement and what are they responsible for is that law enforcement is responsible for the nuts and bolts of police work. And so when we talk about law enforcement, we're going to be focusing primarily on local law enforcement, because the reality is that most of us will have some contact with local police. Very rarely will any of you have any contact with the FBI or any other federal law enforcement agency. And absent maybe the highway patrol, you rarely will have any contact with any other state police agency. Okay, so when we talk about law enforcement, we're going to try to keep it focused and narrow, and we're talking about local law enforcement, right? Those are the people that obviously drive around and mark police cars and respond to calls for services and so forth, okay? So local law enforcement is responsible for the nuts and bolts of police work. They investigate most crimes and attempt to deter crime through patrol activities. They apprehend criminals and participate in trial proceedings if necessary. Their key role in society is basically that of keeping the peace, all right? So let's move on to the next one, which is courts, and we're going to evaluate what the responsibilities are for our courts. The criminal courts is and its work group, which consists of judges, prosecutors, and defense attorneys. There are other people that comprise the court system, but these are the ones that we primarily are more familiar with. Again, that's the judges, prosecutors, and defense attorneys. They're charged with weighty responsibility of determining the innocence or guilt of criminal suspects. So basically, once someone's been arrested by the police and the local prosecutor has filed charges against that individual for a specific crime, then they go to court. And again, it's up to the court to determine the guilt or innocence of an individual and make sure that a person's due process rights have not been violated and their constitutional rights have not been violated and so forth. And that's primarily the responsibility of our local courts. And next we're going to talk about corrections. Now, corrections is tasked with the responsibility of protecting society from dangerous individuals. So in other words, locking people up. This is achieved through a number of means such as imprisonment, probation, parole, county jail, whatever the case may be. So they're tasked with the punishment that is handed down by the court and or a jury. Primarily, hopefully, if the correctional institution is doing its job correctly, there is some type of rehabilitation going on so that they can hopefully reintegrate the offender back into society and make them productive citizens and remove themselves from the criminal element. And that's a primary responsibility, right? So they're tasked with, again, the aspect of punishment, which is incarceration, but also rehabilitation. In other words, trying to correct the behavior that got these people in prison to begin with. So next we're going to look at how do they complement each other. And I offer here a brief example because I think the criminal justice system has, on many occasions, they do complement each other. They do work well together in the means of ensuring justice is carried out. So for example, homicide cases. Oftentimes, homicide cases are very serious offenses, obviously. And so law enforcement will often work with the local prosecutors and from the district attorney's office as they begin to develop their case. And they'll often go to the local prosecutor as they work on search warrant to determine whether or not there's sufficient evidence to arrest somebody, sufficient probable cause, try to eliminate or reduce any legal challenges that might arise during the course of the investigation. So by working closely with the district attorney's office, it is hoped that the law enforcement agency will reduce the legal challenges that might be facing a particular type of case or homicide case in this particular example. If the case raises fewer legal issues, then the court's job is easier because the court will not have to decide motions or legal issues that have been brought before it as part of the case. Or if they do, the decisions will be relatively easy for the court to administer. So again, if we work closely with the local prosecutor in developing our probable cause and collecting the proper evidence and doing so in a constitutionally approved manner, then hopefully it makes the legal challenges less. It makes it easier for the court as the court case proceeds and the court is able to administer appropriate justice if the defendant is found guilty. If the case is well presented and supported with sufficient evidence, appropriate punishment follows. So here we're talking about making sure the punishment fits the crime. For instance, it could be the difference, for example, in a case between first-degree murder and second-degree murder and whether or not as a law enforcement officer, detective, I've been able to show whether or not an individual has met the specific modus operandi or criminal elements associated with first-degree murder versus second-degree murder. So again, working closely with the DA's office helps to build a better case and mitigate some of the legal challenges. So in this particular example, they do complement each other. They help each other. They work as a team in trying to identify the perpetrator of a crime and then developing a case, arresting them, going to court, and then ultimately getting a conviction if the evidence warrants that. Okay? So how do we interact with each other? That was a good example there too, but there we just only interacted really with the district attorney. So how do we interact with each other? And oftentimes this comes in different formats. So for example, a community may be experiencing some type of ongoing criminal activity and will often need the assistance of the courts and the local prosecutor to bring the problem under control. And I've identified a couple here that, a couple of these I've had personal experiences with. So I just highlighted the crime of prostitution, street racing, underage drinking, and I added rowdy college students. But let's take the example of street racing, for example. When I was in policing, our city, the east side of the city was primarily industrial and office buildings, very wide streets, 4 lanes in each direction plus a left-hand turning lane, in some cases 3 lanes in each direction, so we had 6, 7 lanes. But as nighttime came along, the area became rather isolated, less people using the roadway. And what we were discovering was street racing was taking place out there because it's long streets, wide, and they went straight. And so we had a street racing problem. And I'm not talking a small one, I'm talking anywhere from 5 to 1,000 people and probably 300-400 cars. So in order to address that problem, we needed to get the assistance of the local um, supervisor for the district attorney's office, and we also needed to get the courts on board. If we were going to be effective in trying to reduce street racing and its associated crimes, and those crimes included anything from robbery to fights to accidents in which people were killed, we needed to make sure that the courts were on board as well as the district attorney. The district attorney was critical because that's who you go to file criminal charges. The courts were critical because we need to make sure that appropriate punishment was met and dispersed so that it would send a sharp message to these people that this type of behavior is not appropriate. And so in that particular case, we worked with each of these other components of the criminal justice system. So we had to work with the DA's office and we had to work with the courts. We would not have been very effective, for example, if we would have arrested these people for street racing or whatever other vehicle code violations that occurred out there, and the DA was reluctant to file charges, or if the court was not willing to impose a significant punishment, whether in the form of fine or some level of incarceration. So that's just an example of how we actually interacted with each of the other criminal elements. So these things don't operate in a vacuum, and so it's important that we work together if we're going to try to address some community problems, specific community problems that may arise, right? So what would happen if one branch were broken? Well, the example that I can offer you is what happens if corrections, for example, fails in its goal of rehabilitation. And basically what happens, in other words, if someone is released from prison who doesn't have the skills needed to either get a job or get a place to live or something along those lines. So it's important that once the courts met out punishment as a conviction and they're incarcerated, that people get treatment. If they don't get treatment, they don't address the underlying problems that cause them to go to prison, and oftentimes it's a substance abuse issue. Then we have this thing called recidivism, which means a person is released from prison and then almost immediately, within weeks, maybe months, is arrested by the police. We go back to the court system again, and the system starts all over. So if one element is broken, if one branch is broken, then the system is not going to function properly like it should, and that's going to cause us some serious problems. Again, the purpose of the criminal justice system is to control crime, to prevent crime, and to provide and maintain justice. And the idea of justice is often difficult to define. So the book has some interesting ideas on this concept of justice. Okay, so what I perceive as justice, you might not perceive as justice. And so as you read through the books, keep this in mind as to how you would define and explain justice. Because again, each of us has our own interpretation as to what exactly does that mean. Is the criminal justice system broken? This is a significant theme that's discussed. You could check out some of the additional readings. Is the system racist? Think about it on page 15. Is it in need of reform? Currently, states are reevaluating bail. Some states are doing away with bail. They're decriminalizing certain crimes. We're beginning to reevaluate the police use of force and the standards that is used. So all of these things are in the element of reform. And the criminal justice system is going through a considerable amount of discussion lately from the policymaker level. In other words, state legislatures, Congress, local politicians. They're beginning to evaluate the need for criminal justice reform. Key to understanding a lot of this is the two concepts that are described in the book, pages 5 through 7. So make sure you spend some time and carefully review that, and we'll discuss it again next week. That's the crime control model versus the due process model. Finally, is the criminal justice system broken? Think about this as you review page 19 of our textbook, okay? Chapter 2 talks about criminology and crime and how studies have been used to evaluate the effectiveness of programs, which helps policymakers determine whether or not to endorse specific types of concepts. Okay, that's